For over 200 years, it was one of the wealthiest empires on Earth, its capital a glittering metropolis that dwarfed any city in Europe. This is the story of how a single catastrophic battle wiped it from the face of the earth, leaving behind a ghost town forgotten by time. Our story begins in the year 1800 with a Scottish captain named Colin Mackenzie on a journey through southern India. He was an officer for the British East India Company, which was less a simple trading corporation and more a massive entity with its own private army, one that outsized the militaries of entire nations and had, over the previous century, established dominance over huge swathes of India. Welcome to Mythic Index, a sanctuary for lost legends and forgotten timelines. Here, we peel back the layers of history to reveal the myths that shaped our world, from the whispers of ancient stone to the mysteries of the cosmos. If you wish to ensure you can always find your way back to this archive, please subscribe now. Having first arrived in India at 30 years old, Mackenzie was so captivated by the country that he ultimately spent the rest of his life there. His personality was marked by a deep curiosity, which manifested in his passion for collecting historical artifacts. During his nearly 4 decades on the subcontinent, his collection grew to staggering proportions, including 1,500 palm leaf manuscripts in 13 different languages, over 6,000 coins, and thousands of local histories, songs, charts, maps, and sketches. Beyond his collecting, Mackenzie was a talented cartographer, credited with creating the very first accurate geographical map of South India. It's easy to picture his thrill, then, while trekking through the stony terrain of India's Karnataka state, as his local guides mentioned an immense, ruined city hidden nearby, a place that was once the seat of a vast and mighty empire. The guides described these remains as overgrown and decaying, located close to the town of Anagundi by a little village named Hampi. For the local Kannada-speaking population, this place had a more evocative name, Alpatun, which simply means the ruined city. He immediately pressed them to lead him to the site. The details of Mackenzie's visit are preserved in a personal journal he maintained, a document that remains unpublished and is housed as a rough manuscript in the British Library. Within its pages, written in his tidy, looping script, he documented his experience of exploring the sprawling, overgrown remnants of the great metropolis while his guides shared what they knew of its past. South and half-southwest of Anagundi are still remaining many great ruins of the ancient city, palaces, pagodas, drugs, and fortifications, to which the people gave the name Alpatun, or the ruined city. The palaces with the grand stables for elephants and horses are there to be seen. On the southeast of one palace is a place called Vasanta Vudam, formerly the baths of the Rajas. They say that ancient kings used to entertain themselves on certain festivals with throwing saffron-tinged water on their women in a little square basin in the center of the building, surrounded by galleries. Its drain or conduit, almost ruined, is to be still seen. Westward of this bathing place is a line of basins and cups cut out of the fine, black stones and placed on each side of the water conduit. They say that here was formerly the king's garden. All around him, families of monkeys would have scrambled across the massive boulders, their chatter echoing as they chased each other. Ascending the nearby granite hills for a better vantage point, Mackenzie began to sketch the first-ever comprehensive map of the location. He was not a man given to poetic descriptions. His maps and drawings served as his form of expression. Still, his journal entries carefully catalogued the specific features he encountered during his exploration. The interior ramparts, apparently designed to enclose the royal quarter, comprehending the palaces or mahals. Waterworks of the most remarkable sort are visible. An eating place, with a number of black stone slabs laid along a conduit with dishes in the shape of leaves, sculptured on a theme. An octangular baton gallery and fountain in ruins. An elephant stable of 11 strong vaulted divisions, each crowned by a handsome cupola. An aqueduct on stone pillars, which brought water from the tank near Kamlapur to the royal quarter, gardens, fountains. It appears to have been destroyed with much industry. Just a few decades on, in the 1850s, the site was visited by Colonel Alexander Greenlaw, another officer from the East India Company. Greenlaw arrived with an early camera, capturing some of the most poignant photographs ever taken of the ruins in their raw, untouched state. His images show us the very same decaying yet superbly carved structures Mackenzie saw, now blanketed in moss, clumps of cactus-like euphorbia, and wild grasses, with intricate cupolas choked by thick vines. The photographs reveal elegant bathing houses choked with aquatic plants and the once grand halls of forgotten kings, now standing in quiet shade under deteriorating roofs. In his journal, Mackenzie himself described how the city seemed to have been swallowed by the ground over time. This place is now almost ruined, but its remains are still very magnificent and curious. The houses of the inhabitants are entirely destroyed, and the ruins now form high banks and eminences, under which are buried many great houses whose terraces are level with or sunk below the soil. Many of these we can see in passing among the inner ruins. Before we drift deep into the ancient past, take a second to tap the like button. Think of it as lighting a candle in this digital hall, helping other weary travelers find their way to these stories. Just to the south of the royal palace stands a square structure, its roof now completely destroyed. The building was so covered with earth and overgrown with dense bushes that its interior could not be explored. These crumbling structures were the last traces of a city once known as Vijayanagara. As Mackenzie made his way between the toppled pillars, surveying them from a nearby hilltop while drawing his map, the sheer magnificence of the remains left a clear impression on him. He must have been forced to wonder how a society of such immense talent could construct all of this, flourish so completely, and then fade into oblivion. This very story raises profound questions about the civilizations of the past. It makes one wonder what common threads they shared, what specific circumstances led to their fall, and what it truly felt like for the people who were alive to witness the end of their world. This particular account will delve into an empire that has, for many, been almost entirely forgotten. This is the story of southern India's Vijayanagara Empire. Our journey will explore how this incredible society emerged from an era of fragmentation and conflict. We will see how it built one of the medieval world's largest and most breathtaking cities, forging an identity that was at once deeply South Indian and wonderfully global. Finally, this account will uncover the cataclysmic events that brought the magnificent stone temples of Vijayanagara crashing down in ruin. The granite landscape that frames the ruins of Vijayanagara and the modern village of Hampi is one of the most distinctive and memorable on Earth. A surreal and unique vista unfolds here, dominated by enormous, rounded boulders that are often perched in bizarre and precarious balancing acts, resembling giant pebbles piled up along a shore. A later British visitor to the site, a man named A.H. Longhurst, left a particularly vivid description of the area's unique topography. He noted what a strangely wild environment it was to have been the capital and cradle of an empire. Longhurst observed that the whole landscape is dotted with small, barren, rocky hills, and that just north of it, the broad and swift Tungabhadra River carves its way through a channel strewn with yet more boulders, navigating rapids and narrow gorges. The hills themselves are granite, weathered over millennia into every shade from gray to brown and supporting very little vegetation. He suggested that the extreme temperature shifts of the Deccan climate, from scorching days to frigid nights, have cracked and split the massive rock formations. Then, earthquakes in the distant past tore loose the resulting enormous boulders, piling them around the hillsides in a fantastic confusion, or casting them down into the valleys below. Yet, for all its chaotic and unstable appearance, this terrain is actually one of the most ancient and geologically stable surfaces found anywhere on the planet. These vast sheets of granite originated deep beneath the planet's surface somewhere between 3 and 3.5 billion years in the past, during the initial formation of the Earth's crust. Incredibly, some of these very rocks were present for the dawn of life on Earth, bearing witness to the first tiny microbes and bacteria. They have remained here through the ages, watching as life emerged from the seas, as dinosaurs dominated the world only to be annihilated by an object from space, and as humans eventually evolved from small mammals. While softer rock types have worn away all around them over the eons, these tough granites have persisted. The landmass they form the foundation of is called the Indian subcontinent, a place with one of the world's most dynamic interactions between climate and geology. This is an enormous peninsula that juts out from southern Asia, extending downwards for more than 3,000 kilometers from the Himalayan mountains. It's a territory that holds a tremendous variety of landscapes, from the cloud forests and coconut palm beaches in the south, to the snow-covered Himalayas in the north, and all the way to the blistering Thar Desert in the northwest. However, India is broadly categorized into two general regions, North and South India. The north is a terrain of expansive, flat riverlands and grassy plains that stretch toward the horizon before rising into the Himalayan foothills. The south, in contrast, is characterized by an arid, rocky shelf known as the Deccan Plateau. The name Deccan shares its linguistic roots with the Tamil word Thekkanam and the Sanskrit word Dakshina, both of which mean the province of the south. This plateau is a huge, sprawling table of stone that covers large parts of western, central, and southern India. It slopes upward from low elevations in the north to over 1,000 meters in the south, neatly wedged between the western and eastern Ghats mountain ranges. The word Ghat is used in some regional languages to mean the stone steps leading down to a river, and the name was applied to these mountains because they appear to descend to the coast. In fact, the Western Ghats are the eroded remains of what was once this continent's edge, 100 million years ago. As we begin to unravel these lost timelines, leave a comment with the name of the ancient civilization that fascinates you the most. Let's see which era calls to us tonight. This subcontinent wasn't always where it is today. Having torn away from Africa, it embarked on a colossal 6,000-kilometer voyage across the ocean before its eventual collision with Asia. In the immediate aftermath of this continental split, India's western edge is believed to have been a breathtaking, 1,000-meter-high sheer cliff. The relentless forces of erosion and weathering spent the next 100 million years sculpting this massive cliff face, transforming it into the spectacular mountain range that now stretches along the entire coastline, with some peaks reaching as high as 2,600 meters. So immense are these mountains in the south that they act as a barrier to the moisture-laden clouds of the southwest monsoon. This creates two distinct landscapes. To the west lies a lush, tropical green world of mangrove forests and lagoons, while to the east, the Deccan Plateau remains comparatively dry and arid. Yet, several mighty rivers manage to carve their way through this rocky terrain. Originating in the western Ghats, great waterways like the Godavari, the Krishna, the Kaveri, and the Tungabhadra all follow the natural eastward slope of the land. Their journey concludes on the eastern coast, where they pour into the Bay of Bengal. It was against this very backdrop that the epic medieval history of South India was destined to play out. The story of human civilization here stretches back into deepest antiquity. Evidence from mitochondrial DNA suggests that the first modern humans made their way into the subcontinent somewhere between 50,000 and 75,000 years ago, completing a long migration from our East African origins by way of Persia and the Middle East. We can get a glimpse into this ancient past from the rock shelters of Bhimbetka in central India, where cave paintings from roughly 10,000 years ago survive. These artworks depict men riding both horses and elephants, hinting that the relationship between people and animals has been a defining feature of this region from the earliest times. The dawn of agriculture arrived around 6500 BC on the banks of the Indus River, in what is now Balochistan, Pakistan. Here, people first started cultivating winter grasses, wheat, and barley, a revolutionary practice that would spread throughout the entire Indus Valley over the subsequent millennia. This agricultural revolution laid the groundwork for urbanization, and starting around 3000 BC, major cities began to rise. Places we now call Mohenjo-daro and Harappa swelled into bustling centers, with some estimates suggesting they supported populations as large as 60,000 residents. The civilization that flourished in the Indus Valley built its cities with remarkable sophistication. They used baked bricks for construction and engineered complex water supply and drainage networks, alongside structures that appear to have served as workshops and temples. For commerce, its inhabitants relied on a system of standardized weights. Archaeologists have also unearthed massive docks and canals in some cities, supporting the theory of extensive maritime trade. It seems the Indus Valley civilization was connected to Mesopotamia, trading with the Sumerians and Akkadians, as their artifacts have turned up as far away as southern Iraq, Bahrain, and Oman. And it may have been here that the subcontinent's people first learned to harness the incredible power of the elephant. Carved seals from the Indus Valley, dating as far back as 6000 BC, offer what looks like the first proof of organized elephant capture and training. Thousands of years later, by the era of India's first written texts, these tamed giants were a familiar part of daily life, used as living cranes in construction, as transport for the elite, and as formidable weapons on the battlefield. The question of writing itself brings us back to the Indus Valley, where a system of communication may have existed, although scholars still argue about how developed it truly was. Across the ruins of their cities, archaeologists have found hundreds of unique symbols carved onto stamped seals, tiny tablets, and pottery. Some even appear to be remnants of signs that once adorned the gates of their fortified citadels. These markings are incredibly brief, with most consisting of just 4 or 5 characters. Even the lengthiest example discovered on one object contains a mere 17 characters, leaving us to wonder if it represents a fully fledged language. The profound tragedy here is that, if these symbols do constitute a proper script, no one has ever managed to decipher them. Because this script remains a mystery, an entire world of knowledge is inaccessible to us. The actual names of their great cities, the identities of their rulers, their accomplishments, and the stories of ordinary citizens are all buried under the Pakistani landscape, possibly for all time. We are only left with the names assigned to these enigmatic ruins by cultures that came much later. For instance, one of the civilization's most significant urban centers is now called Mohenjo-daro, a Sindhi phrase that translates grimly to the mound of dead men. The precise reasons for this society's collapse are uncertain, but compelling theories exist. Evidence suggests that beginning around 1800 BC, the climate in the Indus Valley became substantially colder and more arid. This shift is connected to a widespread weakening of the monsoon season, a climatic event that might also be implicated in the decline of the Sumerian civilization in far-off Mesopotamia. Unlike some other cultures, the Indus people depended heavily on the river's yearly floods rather than complex irrigation systems. Consequently, when those vital floods began to fail, the river could no longer sustain the large population. It was during this period of turmoil that a group referred to as the Arya is believed to have entered the region. The nature of the Aryans' arrival is shrouded in mystery. Were they peaceful settlers or desperate refugees? Did the local population greet them with open arms or with weapons drawn? Did they introduce new technologies and a new language, or did they adopt these from the existing inhabitants? The specifics remain unknown. However, the outcome established a recurring theme in the subcontinent's long history. Groups of people would journey into India from outside, intermingle with the established populations, and from this fusion, a vibrant new culture would emerge, combining elements both foreign and indigenous. By 1300 BC, the inhabitants of the Indus Valley had abandoned their parched homeland. They journeyed eastward, leaving great cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro to be reclaimed by the desert. Their long migration continued until they came upon a massive, life-giving river that snaked through a vast and fertile floodplain. It was on the shores of this river that the subsequent chapter of India's story was set to unfold. And while our ultimate destination is the arid, rocky Deccan Plateau in the south, the heartland of Vijayanagara, The empire's story truly has its origins here, in this lush northern plain, beside the great river that flows across it. That great river is the Ganges. Revered locally as the Ganga, and often affectionately called Ma Ganga, or the Mother River, its source is an icy cavern known as Gamuk, the cow's mouth, which sits at the base of the massive Gangotri Glacier high in the Himalayas. The colossal weight of the Himalayan mountain chain, formed 50 million years ago, has physically pressed down the surrounding landscape. To the south, this pressure has flattened the ground to nearly sea level, creating a vast plain. It is across this flat expanse that the Ganges travels over 2,500 kilometers from east to west, before its silty waters pour into the sea through the hot mangrove swamps of the Bay of Bengal. For thousands of years, this monumental waterway has supported roughly a tenth of the global population with food, water, and fish, acting as a crucial highway for both people and commerce. On the Yamuna, a major tributary of the Ganges, lies the city of Delhi. As one of the planet's most ancient urban centers, Delhi has been continuously occupied for over 8 millennia. The soil along the Yamuna's banks is exceptionally rich, which has always allowed the local population to thrive. It was precisely in this northwestern part of India, in the era after the Indus Valley civilization's decline, that the region's first written texts were composed in the old northern language of Sanskrit. These writings, known as the Vedas, began appearing around 3,500 years ago. Sadly for historians, many of these initial texts were inscribed on delicate, perishable materials, often on paper crafted from Himalayan birch tree bark using inks derived from ash. While a few remarkable examples have survived from as early as the 3rd or 4th centuries, the vast majority have been lost to time. The most ancient of these Sanskrit works, the Rigveda, was likely passed down through oral tradition starting in at least the 2nd millennium BC, more than 4,000 years ago. It contains a poetic account of how written language itself came into being in this area. When in giving names, they first set forth the beginning of language. Their most excellent and spotless secret was laid bare through love. When the wise ones formed language with their mind, purifying it like grain with a winnowing fan, then friends knew friendships, an auspicious mark placed on their language. The emergence of these texts created an enormous shift. For roughly a millennium following 300 BC, the Sanskrit language, which was once confined to northern India, spread to overshadow all others. It became the shared medium for art, science, religion, and poetry, in a role very similar to that of Latin in Europe. During this era, the Vedic religion took shape based on the scriptures of the Vedas. Through a series of adaptations and evolutionary changes, this would eventually become the faith we recognize today as Hinduism. Although the lands of India are now unified as a single modern nation, it stands as one of the most diverse states on Earth. It is certainly the largest country to contain so many distinct cultures within its borders. The people of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and all of modern India's 28 states are as culturally distinct from each other as the people of France, Germany, and Italy. They differ in their traditional attire, cuisine, ritual practices, and the 22 major official languages spoken throughout the subcontinent. In the regions south of Maharashtra in central India, the languages stem from the Dravidian family, a group found exclusively in India. Meanwhile, Marathi, the language of Maharashtra, and all the principal northern languages, including ancient Sanskrit, belong to the Indo-European family, which also counts English as a member. But the most profound regional variations are found in matters of faith. The modern term, Hinduism, is often applied as a broad umbrella for a vast array of different religious traditions that originated in India and share the ancient Vedas as their common foundation. Knowledge grows when it is shared. If you know a fellow seeker, or just someone who needs a peaceful escape into the past, feel free to share this video with them. This incredible variation exists because there has never been a single, central authority governing Indian religion, which its followers often call Sanatana Dharma, the eternal way. A core belief, simplified, is in one God, Brahman, whose essence is refracted into countless forms, much like a single beam of light splits into a rainbow through a prism. The ancient Maitreya describes this concept, adding that a spark of this supreme power exists within every living being. Now the part of him which belongs to darkness, that is called Rudra, that part of him which belongs to obscurity, that is called Brahma, that part of him which belongs to goodness, that is called Vishnu. He being one becomes 3, becomes 8, becomes 11, becomes 12, becomes infinite, because he thus came to be, he is the being. He moves about, having entered all beings. He has become the Lord of all beings. That is the soul within and without, yet within and without. Despite the potential for countless divine forms, the worship of most Hindus predominantly centers on one of two principal manifestations, the gods Shiva and Vishnu. This differs from the familiar Abrahamic worldview, where a good creator god is opposed by a destructive force like Satan. In the Hindu cosmos, a single deity can embody both principles. Shiva, for instance, is a god who is simultaneously the creator and the destroyer, a beautiful yet fearsome figure representing the universe's primal energy. He is often shown as a cosmic dancer, whose movements symbolize the universe's eternal cycle from creation to destruction and back again. This perpetual rhythm is visible everywhere, in flowers that bloom, wither, and then die, or in people who pass from childhood to old age and finally to death. This mindset sees creation and destruction not as opposing forces, but as intertwined parts of a single process. A beautiful mushroom, for example, can sprout from a decaying log. The death of a gazelle provides life for a cheetah, and the collapse of one civilization often gives rise to another. Functioning as the preserver within this cosmic dance is the god Vishnu. His role is to maintain order and hold the world together, at least for a while, as Shiva's cycle continues. When the need is great, he descends to earth in a human avatar, taking the form of legendary heroes like Krishna or Rama. A passage in the Bhagavad Gita explains this role perfectly. Whenever righteousness wanes and unrighteousness increases, I send myself forth for the protection of the good and for the destruction of evil and for the establishment of righteousness. I come into being age after age. It's crucial to grasp, then, that the India of this era was a mosaic of diverse sects, orders, and religious traditions. While we use the single label Hinduism, today, the people living back then would have viewed these groups as profoundly distinct, and relations between them were frequently marked by intense hostility. It was into this complex religious landscape that new influences from the wider world would soon arrive. Historians once portrayed the Indian subcontinent as a geographical fortress, supposedly isolated by vast mountains and surrounding seas. The historical reality, however, reveals a constant ebb and flow of peoples, who brought their unique cultures, cuisines, and beliefs with them as they moved across its borders. Far from being a fortress, India was a major crossroads. The ocean, rather than acting as a barrier, served as a bustling superhighway, linking the subcontinent to the Persian Gulf and Red Sea in the west, and to Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and China in the east. This global connectivity is why the meals of Roman senators were seasoned with Indian pepper and cinnamon, and how a bronze Buddha statue from India ended up in a 9th-century Viking burial on the tiny Swedish island of Helgö. To the northwest, the towering mountains of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan presented a daunting obstacle, but this was not an impassable wall. Well-trodden routes, such as the Khyber and Bolan passes, carved paths through the rugged terrain near the Indus River Valley, supporting traffic as vibrant as any maritime route. These passes were so established, in fact, that Alexander the Great successfully marched his massive army through them into the Punjab region in the 4th century BC, a path many subsequent conquerors would follow. Even the Himalayas, the most formidable barrier of all, could not prevent the diffusion of ideas, as Indian Buddhism traveled over them into Tibet and throughout Southeast Asia, eventually reaching as far north as Japan. Into this interconnected world, a new faith was destined to join the subcontinent's rich tapestry of beliefs, during the latter half of the first millennium AD. Islam. Its arrival promised both cultural enrichment and violent conflict. While it would carve a deep cultural divide across the land, it would simultaneously forge new links to the great global capitals, ushering in an era of technological progress. This period was defined by paradox and irony, with the most significant being that Islam's introduction would inadvertently set the stage for the creation of the Vijayanagara Empire, arguably the most powerful Hindu kingdom the peninsula had ever seen. The story of Islam in India is a sprawling and intricate one. Tradition holds that the faith first reached the subcontinent's shores within the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad himself, carried by maritime merchants sailing from the Persian Gulf. For the people of India, this new belief system must have seemed utterly foreign. For instance, Muslims consumed beef, an act unthinkable to Hindus who revered the cow, yet they abstained from pork. Where Hindus saw divinity in many different forms, Muslims held a strict belief in a single, indivisible God. And while Hindu worship often involved offerings to idols and statues, Islamic tradition forbade any artistic representation of the divine. Yet, the religion's peaceful introduction via trade in the south stood in stark contrast to the far more violent entry it would make into northern India. At the same time, great Hindu empires like the Pallavas, Pandyas, and Cholas rose to prominence, expanding their influence across the continent. This cultural wave carried the Sanskrit language to places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cambodia, establishing it as the premier language for scholarship and faith throughout the Asian continent. However, these very arteries of commerce and culture also served as pathways for peril, exposing India to the world beyond its borders. Formidable adversaries lurked in the lands past the great mountain ranges. Among them were colossal nomadic armies of horsemen from the wild steppes of Central Asia. These groups would periodically surge down through the Khyber Pass to plunder Indian lands, before vanishing back into their remote territories. But not every group was content with just raiding. Some arrived with the goal of outright conquest. In the 2 decades following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Muslim forces executed one of the most astonishing military campaigns in all of recorded history. The Arabic-speaking peoples, once a minor power on the periphery, exploded onto the global stage. They swiftly defeated 2 of the ancient world's heavyweights, the Byzantine and Sassanid empires. Tracing a path eastward similar to the one Alexander the Great had blazed centuries earlier, they subjugated one kingdom after another. Their domains soon spanned 3 continents, with frontiers that touched the borders of China, Europe, and India. For the Muslims of that era, this incredible success was seen as undeniable validation of their prophet's divine message. Yet, as Alexander himself had discovered nearly 1,000 years prior, a spectacular string of victories does not instantly create a lasting, stable empire. Echoing the fate of Alexander's conquests, the newly acquired Arab territories quickly fragmented. The vast domain shattered like a bubble, breaking into a collection of independent Muslim kingdoms scattered across Central Asia and the Middle East. These new realms were governed by rulers known as sultans. This title comes from the Arabic word sulta, meaning power, so a sultan was literally the one with power. For the next 300 years, these new Muslim kingdoms remained on the opposite side of the Indus River, making no significant incursions into India. The Hindu kings governing North India regarded them with caution, but they didn't seem to perceive them as a fundamentally different threat from the many other groups that had come and gone in the area. They used various names for them, sometimes calling them Turks or Tirushkas, and at other times Tajiks. Or they might be confusingly referred to as Greeks, but a far more common term was Memleka, a word that essentially means barbarian. For these burgeoning Muslim kingdoms, the immense wealth of the Ganges plain presented a target that was simply too tempting to ignore. India, at this moment in history, possessed what was quite likely the most sophisticated economy on the planet. And unlike Alexander the Great, These Muslim sultans were fully aware of the subcontinent's incredible size and riches. Starting from the year 1000, a series of increasingly aggressive raids began, typically launched from warrior kingdoms located in the area of Afghanistan. These horsemen would storm south down the Balan Pass to plunder the lands of India. But toward the end of the 12th century, a new and far more ambitious group arrived, and this time they planned on staying. These were the Ghurids, a Turkic people from a dynasty of Iranian origin that ruled the Ghor region of modern-day Afghanistan. While they had a long history of raiding northern India, riding down from the mountains to burn cities and haul away loot, they had recently converted to Islam under Persian influence. A new Ghurid ruler then set his sights on a prize greater than anything that could be strapped to a horse. This man is known to us today as Muhammad Ghuri. Born in 1149 in the mountainous region of Ghor, Muhammad Ghuri was a product of a changing world. His homeland had been predominantly Buddhist for 1,000 years, but starting in the 11th century, it became progressively more Muslim, eventually becoming a center for Islamic teachers and scholars. As a warlord, Muhammad Ghuri's goal was not just to loot North India like his ancestors, but to conquer his own territory and settle there permanently. As soon as the annual monsoon ended in northern India, he swept down the Khyber Pass. His army, powered by strong Afghan horses and bulked up with a large force of slave soldiers, rapidly seized land in the Punjab, a lush, green territory at the foot of the Himalayas. The Persian scholar Farishta, who settled in India in the 16th century, gives a sparse account of this campaign. He tells us that in the following year, after reinforcing his army, Muhammad Ghuri marched on Peshawar and quickly subdued it. After returning to Ghazni, he marched the next year towards Dibul in the Sindh province, overrunning the entire country to the sea and returning loaded with treasure. In the borderlands of the Punjab, Muhammad Ghuri would establish a new Sunni Islamic kingdom. This new kingdom, located east of the Indus River, was ripe for expansion. Muhammad Ghuri dispatched his generals to seize more land, and in 1193, a notable success came from one of his military slaves who captured the minor regional capital of Delhi. Following his master's return, the general secured the fort of Meerut and the city of Delhi itself, which he transformed into his seat of government. It's because of this that many foreign accounts claim a slave founded the Delhi Empire. All surrounding districts were then compelled to acknowledge the faith of Islam. Through these actions, Muhammad Ghuri built the bedrock of a Muslim kingdom destined to govern a vast portion of India for the next 3 centuries, permanently embedding Muslim culture into the region. This powerful new entity would become famous in history as the Sultanate of Delhi. It's remarkable how little we actually know about the daily existence of India's Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist populations under this new Islamic administration. Personal experiences surely varied enormously based on location and circumstance. While some Hindus undoubtedly harbored deep resentment for their conquerors, many others likely just continued with their daily routines. For another group, this new political landscape presented unique opportunities, prompting some to convert. Historical records are strangely silent on widespread religious strife between the Muslim leadership and their Hindu populace. While it's true that some Hindu temples were destroyed or repurposed as mosques, a great number were also left untouched. The new rulers often expressed disdain for Hindu beliefs, particularly what they labeled as idol worship, yet they never went so far as to outlaw the religion. Pragmatism seems to have been the guiding principle for these sultans, who understood the importance of not needlessly provoking their subjects. The most intense resistance typically came from tribal groups in isolated regions. Urban centers show scant evidence of major revolts. And although the sultans often framed their military campaigns as holy missions in their official narratives, it's unlikely that religion was their primary motivation. The more immediate concerns of maintaining power and prestige, common to all rulers, probably dominated their thinking. In fact, historical accounts detail far more endless squabbles between different Muslim factions than they do about clashes with their Hindu citizens. But that tribal resistance could be incredibly ferocious. A prime example occurred in 1206, when Muhammad Ghuri was in the mountainous Sindh region putting down an uprising by the Ghakkar hill tribe of Punjab. A small band of Ghakkar fighters, seeking vengeance for lost relatives, managed to infiltrate his camp one night. The chronicler Farishta gives a vivid account. Near the village of Rodak on the Indus River, a group of Ghakkars conspired to assassinate the king. Under the cover of darkness, they made their way to his quarters. As one assassin was stopped by a sentry, he silenced the guard with a dagger, allowing the rest of the group to rush inside the king's tent. The Sultan was sleeping, attended by two slaves who could only watch, frozen in horror. The Ghakkars wasted no time, plunging their daggers into the king's body. An examination later revealed he had suffered a staggering 22 stab wounds. And so, after a rule spanning 32 years, Sultan Muhammad Ghuri was dead. Yet this was just the beginning of a downturn in the fortunes of the region's Muslims. In that very same year, an event of world-shaking significance was unfolding on the distant Mongolian steppes. A great confederation of nomadic tribes united and proclaimed a new leader, Genghis Khan, as their supreme emperor. Soon after, he launched a devastating invasion into China, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 10 to 40 million people. His armies then swept westward through Persia and the Middle East, ripping the soul out of the Islamic world and incinerating its great centers of learning, like Baghdad. Within just a few decades, it's believed that his conquests were responsible for the deaths of roughly 10% of the entire global population. This cataclysm triggered a massive exodus of Muslim Turks from areas like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Persia. Huge numbers of these refugees made their way to the relative safety of the new Muslim-ruled kingdoms in North India. It was a dramatic reversal. Where Muslims had first entered the subcontinent as conquerors, they were now arriving in droves as desperate refugees. The century that followed the death of Muhammad Ghuri was a chaotic period defined by a parade of ineffectual rulers, paranoid tyrants, and a seemingly endless cycle of assassinations. This instability was compounded by persistent invasion attempts from the great Khans of Mongolia, who sought to conquer northern India. Yet the Sultanate's formidable cavalry proved more than a match for the invaders, consistently repelling the Mongol hordes and, on several occasions, dealing them devastating losses on the battlefield. In a remarkable twist of history, the Delhi Sultans, themselves descendants of foreign conquerors, became the subcontinent's staunchest defenders, forming the only real barrier preventing the Khans from sweeping south and inflicting the same horrors they had upon the people of China. Successfully fending off the Mongol incursions had the effect of creating battle-hardened and highly experienced armies, which in turn allowed the sultans to tighten their grip on North India. They systematically conquered the remaining fractured Hindu kingdoms, and as the Mongol danger in the north began to fade, their attention turned toward extending their frontiers southward. Under the rule of the Khilji dynasty, the Sultanate's forces, commanded by a brilliant eunuch slave general named Malik Kafur, pushed across the Vindhya Mountains, which had long served as the geographical divider between North and South India. They subjugated new lands there and compelled the regional kingdoms to become tributaries. By the turn of the 14th century, the Delhi Sultanate was a durable power whose territory ran from the Indus Valley clear to the Bay of Bengal, and from the Himalayan foothills down to the entrance of the Deccan's arid plateau. This empire was a Sunni Islamic state with a blended Turkic and Persian culture. In its periods of stability, its leaders dreamed of pushing even deeper into the south, with the ultimate goal of flying their flag over the entire subcontinent. The man who would finally bring these ambitions to fruition was Muhammad bin Tughlaq, arguably one of the most complex and controversial rulers in India's history. The year 1325, when Muhammad bin Tughlaq ascended the throne at 35 years old, was a notable one across the globe. In West Africa, the great King Mansa Musa of Mali was completing his pilgrimage to Mecca, distributing so much gold along his route that he destabilized the economies of the entire Middle East. Far away in the Valley of Mexico, a weary group of wanderers finally settled on a lake island, founding the settlement that would grow into the mighty city of Tenochtitlan. And in the court of Delhi, a new sultan was being crowned amid whispers of murder, betrayal, and treachery. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a mercurial and enigmatic figure. He was a genuine intellectual, fluent in Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Sanskrit, and an expert on the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence, with a noted passion for poetry. While a devout Muslim like all Delhi sultans, he was unusually tolerant of other faiths and remains the only sultan known to have actively participated in the Hindu festivals of his subjects. Yet, this cultured man possessed a profoundly dark side. His father, the founder of the Tughlaq dynasty, had risen from humble beginnings as the son of a slave and a Hindu woman. However, just 5 years into his reign, the new emperor was killed in a bizarre incident. The sultan was relaxing under a pavilion with his favorite son and chosen heir when the entire structure suddenly gave way, crushing both men to death. Some accounts claim the pavilion was struck by a bolt of lightning. One contemporary account from a scholar named Bharani attributes the tragedy to an act of God. He wrote that a celestial thunderbolt came down from the heavens, causing the roof above the sultan to give way and fatally crush him along with 5 or 6 other people. However, a far more sinister version of events comes from the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, who was visiting the Delhi Sultanate at the time but wisely waited until he was safe in his home city of Fez to write about it. He alleged the entire collapse was no accident but a carefully engineered assassination, masterminded by the king's own son, who was next in line for the throne, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. The trap was designed so that the weight of elephants on one specific side would bring the entire structure down. After the sultan dismounted, his son requested permission to show off the elephants in a parade. The animals were then guided along a predetermined path, and as soon as they stepped on the trigger point, the pavilion crashed down upon the sultan and his other son, Mahmud. Muhammad bin Tughlaq then called for axes and shovels to begin a rescue, yet he secretly signaled for the work to be delayed. The tools didn't arrive until well after sunset. Once they finally excavated the site, they discovered the dead sultan, his body arched over his son in a final, futile attempt to shield him. Unsurprisingly, for a ruler who seized power through such betrayal, Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign was defined by a deep-seated paranoia that others would try to depose him in the same way. This fear manifested in a pattern of delivering incredibly harsh punishments for even the slightest offenses. The traveler Ibn Battuta expressed his utter shock at the sultan's treatment of his subjects. He wrote that the sultan was excessively eager to shed blood, punishing both minor and major faults without any regard for a person's status, piety, or noble birth. Every single day, hundreds of people were dragged into his audience hall in chains. Some were destined for execution, others for torture, and the rest for a brutal beating. The chronicler Farishta paints an even more horrifying picture. He wrote that the sultan spilled the blood of God's creatures with such ease that one could almost believe his goal was the complete annihilation of the human race. Not a week went by, he claimed, in which the sultan didn't execute at least one of the holy men or scholars in his court, or one of his own secretaries. This unrelenting brutality earned him the nickname Mohammed Kuni, which means Mohammed the Bloody. What's truly fascinating is that this cruel tyrant was also an ambitious reformer, dead set on implementing a whole host of modernizing policies throughout the Sultanate. The problem was, every single one of them ended in absolute disaster. Taking a cue from China, he tried to introduce copper coins to replace the existing silver ones, which he hoped would protect the economy from unpredictable swings in the silver supply. But the new copper coins were incredibly simple to forge. In response, citizens all over the Sultanate started melting down their household copper pots and pans to mint their own currency. The value of the new money had completely collapsed, forcing a return to silver coins at a devastating financial loss to the state. This kind of erratic behavior leads some to speculate that Muhammad bin Tughlaq may have been afflicted by a serious mental illness. It is strange to think these figures once walked the earth, looking up at the same stars we do. If you are enjoying this journey through time so far, comment the word ancient so I know you're still with me. A popular tale, recorded by the Portuguese traveler Fernão Nunes, perfectly illustrates the king's bizarre nature. The story goes that one morning, as the king was getting dressed, a single ray of sunlight shone through a closed window and into his eyes. He instantly flew into a rage, declaring that he would not rest until he had vanquished whoever dared intrude upon his private chambers. His court nobles desperately tried to calm him, explaining that his foe was the sun, a celestial body essential for all life and impossible to harm. Tughlaq, however, was not to be swayed and ordered his army to prepare for battle. He then marched out with a massive force, claiming he was going to find his enemy. As the army advanced, it kicked up such a colossal cloud of dust that it completely blotted out the sun. Seeing this, his clever captains informed him that his enemy had clearly fled in terror. The king, content with this outcome, declared himself satisfied and turned his army back towards the city. Now, while this account certainly sounds more like a fanciful folk tale than a historical record, the very existence of such a story points to a ruler known for his instability and indecisiveness. More concrete examples of his disastrous judgment are not hard to find. In one instance, he reportedly assembled an army of 100,000 soldiers and marched them directly into the Himalayas. There, the force was easily trapped and decimated by the local Hindu tribes who knew the terrain. The scale of the catastrophe was so complete that it is said only a single horseman managed to escape and return to Delhi with the news. Perhaps his most calamitous decision, however, was the forced relocation of his capital. Arguing that Delhi was too exposed to attacks from Mongols, he decreed a move to the city of Devagiri, a staggering 1,200 kilometers to the south. The order was absolute. Every single resident of Delhi was to abandon their home and undertake the grueling overland journey. Accounts from this time are horrific, with thousands perishing along the way. The famous traveler Ibn Battuta, who arrived shortly after, found Delhi to be a deserted ghost town. He wrote that the Sultan had issued a proclamation promising punishment for anyone found within the city, forcing a total evacuation. "When I entered Delhi," Battuta recalled, "it was almost a desert." He even relates a story of the king climbing to the roof of his palace to gaze out over the empty city, the streets silent, not a wisp of smoke rising from any chimney. Upon seeing this desolate scene, the king supposedly sighed and stated, "Now my heart is satisfied and my feelings are appeased." This chillingly unpredictable behavior was a hallmark of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's rule, and before long the consequences of his chaotic rule would come crashing down. A perfect example was the debacle with his capital. After completing the punishing relocation of Delhi's entire population, he abruptly reversed the decision, forcing everyone on the long march back home. For the kingdoms of the south, this bizarre attempt to bring the Sultanate's center of power closer was a clear signal of imperial ambition heading their way. At that moment, the Delhi Sultanate appeared to be an invincible force. Even throughout the 26-year reign of its capricious monarch, the empire's expansion continued relentlessly. The southern Kakatiyas and other neighboring Hindu states were systematically absorbed, pushing the Sultanate's borders to their greatest extent around 1335. This vast territory now formed a massive belt spanning the subcontinent from sea to sea, covering nearly the entire peninsula. But this peak of power proved to be fragile. The mad Sultan, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, met his end in 1351 while trying to suppress a Turkic tribe in the mountains of modern-day Pakistan. While his exact cause of death remains unknown, a contemporary scholar summed up the event with a dry observation. The Sultan was rid of the people, and the people of the Sultan. It seems Tughlaq's brutal personality, despite his despotic style, had been the one thing holding his vast empire together. In the wake of his death, the Delhi Sultanate began to completely unravel. Newly conquered territories erupted in open rebellion. A bitter war of succession fractured the empire into competing factions, as powerful nobles everywhere established their own independent states. By 1345, the minting of imperial coins in South India had ceased entirely, a sure sign of lost control. The years that followed descended into a maelstrom of anarchy and disintegration. Word of this internal collapse inevitably reached opportunistic enemies beyond the northern mountains. Among them was the Turco-Mongolian emperor and warlord known as Timur, the last of the great nomadic conquerors from the Eurasian steppe. Learning of the Sultanate's weakness, Timur led his army south in 1398, leaving a trail of plunder and death. Upon reaching Delhi, he subjected the city to a merciless sacking, looting its treasures and putting its people to the sword. The horrific massacre may have claimed as many as 200,000 lives. Timur himself later provided a rather self-serving account of the atrocity, writing, "There was likewise an immense loot of rubies, diamonds, garnets, pearls, and other gems. Excepting the quarter of the Sayyids, the scholars, and the other Mussulmans, the whole city was sacked. Although I was desirous of sparing them, I could not succeed, for it was the will of God that this calamity should befall the city." Having no desire to rule India, Timur simply gathered the plundered wealth and countless enslaved artisans, and marched back to his capital of Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan. Much like the sack of Rome, Timur's devastation ripped the heart out of an already failing empire. The dynasties that emerged in its aftermath were powerless to control the once vast territories, becoming little more than local warlords. The lands once united under the Sultanate were plunged into an era of anarchy, chaos, and plague. It was a period of profound transformation, defined by immense suffering, but also by incredible opportunity. From this landscape of blood and fire, two brothers would emerge from obscure origins to redefine the balance of power. The story of Vijayanagara truly begins with them. Their destiny was to shift the center of Indian influence from the Muslim north to the Hindu south, and erect a city that would be counted among the medieval world's greatest metropolises. They were called the Sangama brothers, and their names were Harihara and Bukka. The precise origins of Harihara and Bukka are a historical mystery. A popular theory among historians is that they served as commanders for the southern Hoysala Empire. In this version, they were likely stationed along the rocky shores of the Tungabhadra River, tasked with defending against Muslim incursions from the north. Other, more romanticized tales claim the brothers were generals for the defeated Kakatiyas who were captured, taken to Delhi as prisoners, and forced to convert to Islam before escaping and returning to their original faith. However, these dramatic accounts are absent from contemporary sources, suggesting they are likely unreliable legends. Many of these stories converge on the idea that the brothers had a fateful encounter with a Hindu sage named Sri Vidyaranya. One particularly famous legend, chronicled by the historian Robert Sewell, tells of a strange event that happened while Harihara was on a hunt, an event the sage would help him understand. While tracking prey in the mountains south of the river, the chief witnessed something truly astonishing. A small hare, rather than running from his hounds, turned on them ferociously and began to bite. Pondering this incredible sight on his way home, the baffled king encountered the very same sage, Vidyaranya, whose name means forest of learning, by the river, and the holy man told him to build a city right there. The king followed this advice without hesitation, beginning construction on his new capital that very day and encircling it with fortifications. This tale is almost certainly a myth, but it perfectly captures the self-image Vijayanagara would later cultivate, that of the cornered prey that had found its teeth and was ready to fight back. With the Delhi Sultanate's authority crumbling, Bukka and Harihara capitalized on the chaos by assembling a formidable army, combining the strength of resentful Hindu nobles with large groups of Muslim mercenary fighters. It's quite possible many of these mercenaries were former soldiers of the Sultanate, now unemployed and unpaid after its decline. The brothers unleashed this new military force across the south, aiming to seize control of all the territory the Sultanate had abandoned. Their proposition to the local Hindu rulers was simple and compelling. Unite with them to guarantee that South India would be governed by Hindus, an appeal that proved incredibly persuasive. In just a couple of decades, the Sangama brothers succeeded in consolidating their rule over most of the south, though several isolated pockets of territory remained under the control of now-stranded Muslim governors. One such holdout was in the dry plains of Tamil Nadu, India's most southerly state, where a fragile Muslim authority known as the Madurai Sultanate was desperately clinging to power. By this point, Bukka of the Sangama dynasty was the reigning king, and he was married to a celebrated poet named Ganga Devi. In the classical language of Sanskrit, she composed a magnificent epic poem titled Madhura Vijayam, which translates to the victory of Madurai. The poem's narrative involves a woman from the sacred city of Madurai who travels to King Bukka's court, pleading for him to liberate her home. She paints a grim picture of how Madurai's ancient Hindu temples had decayed terribly under the neglect of their Muslim leadership. White ants have destroyed the doors. The door frame of the sanctum is broken due to the wild growth of trees, plants, and creepers. The temple premises that formerly echoed the soft beating of the drums are now full of wild, wallowing jackals. The place once filled with the odor of sacrificial smoke and the melodious chant of Vedic mantras is now full of the foul stench of rot and decay. Thick cobwebs now cling to the magnificent statues that once graced the city's soaring towers, a sad shroud over their former beauty. To understand how such a metropolis rose and fell, we must go back to its very beginning. The story starts with the Sangama brothers. Whether their motivations were purely religious or not, they led their forces southward to swiftly overwhelm the isolated Madurai Sultanate. With this victory, the southern Tamil lands fell under their dominion, making the brothers masters of a vast and prosperous new territory. Their journey then led them back to a familiar post along the stony, granite shores of the Tungabhadra River. It was a humble, unassuming spot, a small village known primarily as a pilgrimage destination due to its local shrine to Shiva. It was on this very ground that they laid the foundations for a metropolis whose sheer scale and ambition would herald the emergence of a bold new power in South India. The name they chose was symbolic: Vijayanagara, a Sanskrit compound of Vijaya for victory and Nagara for city. It was to be the city of victory. The city the Sangamas raised from the banks of the Tungabhadra was a physical embodiment of their grand aspirations. With its magnificent temples reaching for the sky and its broad, planned-out boulevards, it displayed a remarkable command of urban design. Yet, this masterpiece was also shaped by the harsh realities of the era, and Vijayanagara was conceived first and foremost as an impregnable stronghold. Nature had already provided a formidable blueprint for defense. The impassable granite hills offered natural barriers, while the wide, fast-flowing Tungabhadra River guarded its northern flank, making it nearly uncrossable for a hostile army. The brothers augmented these gifts of nature, constructing strong gates and towers to fortify the passes between the hills. The remnants of these massive walls can still be seen today, enclosing a staggering area of over 650 square kilometers. A visiting Afghan diplomat, Abdur Razak, was left in awe during his 15th-century visit, capturing the city's incredible structure in his writings. He noted, "It is built in such a manner that 7 citadels and the same number of walls enclose each other. The 7th fortress, which is placed in the center of the other, occupies an area 10 times larger than the marketplace of the city of Herat. It is the place which is used as the residence of the king." Sentinels constantly patrolled these ramparts, keeping a vigilant eye from watch posts that overlooked the major thoroughfares leading into and out of the city. Clever defensive features were integrated between the layers of walls. Zones were deliberately littered with large boulders, called horse stones, specifically to cripple cavalry charges. This design ensured that any invading force would be slowed to a crawl, becoming easy targets for the archers raining down arrows from the safety of the walls above. The sheer scale of these fortifications makes perfect sense when you consider the political climate of the time. The power vacuum left by the disintegration of the Delhi Sultanate had given rise to a mosaic of successor states, each, like Vijayanagara, born from the preceding chaos. Among these new powers, one emerged in South India as Vijayanagara's most formidable rival, the Bahmani Sultanate. Tradition holds that this new kingdom's story began with Zafar Khan, a military commander formerly in the service of the unpredictable Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Sensing the terminal decline of his former masters, Zafar Khan made a bold move in 1347. He proclaimed his own sovereignty, carving out a significant kingdom for himself from the rugged Deccan Plateau. It was a calculated risk that succeeded brilliantly. The Delhi Sultanate, overwhelmed by its own internal crises, was powerless to challenge him south of the Vindhya Mountains and simply let him be. From its very inception, this new state was forged in conflict. An early victory over a local Hindu king yielded an extraordinary piece of tribute, an opulent turquoise-enameled throne that would forever be associated with Bahmani authority. As the chronicler Farishta recalled, this throne would become a growing symbol of their empire. The throne was in length 9 feet and 3 in breadth, made of ebony covered with plates of pure gold, and set with precious stones of immense value. Every prince of the house of Bahmani who possessed this throne made a point of adding to it some rich stones. I learned that it was called the turquoise throne from being partly enameled of a sky color, which was in time totally concealed by the number of jewels. This stunning creation became the famed turquoise throne of the Bahmanis, a powerful emblem of Muslim sovereignty in southern India. Adding to its grandeur, a ceremonial umbrella was placed above it, an item Farishta also found remarkable. He wrote that its pinnacle featured a golden ball set with jewels, on which was a bird of paradise composed of precious stones, with its head crowned by a ruby of inestimable value, a personal gift the late Sultan had once received from the king of Vijayanagara. As this first Bahmani Sultan lay dying, he named his son Mohammad Shah Bahmani as his successor. The chronicler Farishta recorded the Sultan's final plea for his sons to unite and build an enduring kingdom. "I conjure you, as you value the performance of this kingdom, to agree with each other. Mohammed is my successor. Esteem submission and loyalty to him as your duty in this world, and your surely for happiness in the next." Thus, the Bahmani Sultanate was born, a powerful Muslim kingdom in South India's heartland that would survive for almost 2 centuries. For the Hindu people of Vijayanagara, this new power was a permanent, looming threat on their border. Nationalist historians from both India and the West have often framed the conflict between these medieval kingdoms as a simple clash of cultures. In this view, Hindu Vijayanagara is seen as a bastion, bravely defending its traditions from Islamic invaders. Yet, there is little historical evidence to suggest the people or rulers of Vijayanagara actually saw their situation this way. An inscription from the Sangama brothers' era, celebrating King Bukka Raya's triumphs, offers a fascinating look into this mindset. It clearly shows the Turkic Bahmani Sultanate was seen as just one adversary on a long list of enemies. Tellingly, the other enemies on that list were all fellow Hindu kingdoms. The text boasts that when the king's sword began to dance on the battlefield, the faces of the Turks shriveled up, Konkaya Sankaparya was filled with fear, the Andhras ran into caves, the Gurjaras lost the use of their limbs on every road, the Kambodjas' courage was broken, the Kalingas suffered defeat. There is no mention of religion here, nor is there any hint that the Muslim Bahmanis were considered more despicable than rivals like the Hindu kings of Kalinga on the eastern coast. Little evidence suggests the rulers of Vijayanagara viewed themselves as defenders of Hinduism, an idea that makes sense, as a unified Hindu identity simply did not exist in the 14th century. While their wars against the Bahmanis were long and brutal, they fought equally vicious campaigns against the Hindu Gajapatis, who commanded the humid, elephant-filled forests to the east. If religious strife did flare up within Vijayanagara, it was nearly always an internal affair, pitting followers of Vishnu against Shiva or Hindus against Jains. The actual conflicts between the Bahmani sultans and Vijayanagara were driven by much more practical matters, boiling down to pure economics, control over resources, supply lines, and trade routes. The most bitter point of contention was a rich piece of land situated between them known as the Raichur Doab. This triangular stretch of land, formed where the Krishna and Tungabhadra rivers converged, was not only incredibly fertile, but also contained valuable deposits of iron and even diamonds. Other wars would ignite over the rich river deltas further east and the western coast of India, which was home to wealthy trading ports. These ports governed sea traffic with the Muslim world, acting as a vital pipeline for the most important strategic military supply of the age. Powerful war horses imported from Arabia, Persia, and Central Asia. With such contentious territories always on their minds, warfare between the Bahmani Sultanate and Vijayanagara became a constant feature of the era. Thanks to their strong connections to the Muslim world, the Bahmanis held an advantage for much of this period. Being well supplied with horses earned the Bahmani Sultan the title of Ashvapati, or Lord of Horses. In contrast, the kings of Vijayanagara, with their enormous armies of massed infantry, became known as Narapati, or Lord of Men. The Hindu Gajapati king in the east, with his vast stables of war elephants, completed this regional triangle of power as the Lord of Elephants. The Portuguese visitor Domingo Pires was certainly impressed by Vijayanagara's infantry after witnessing a procession in the year 1520. He wrote, "The troops on foot are so many that they surrounded all the valleys and hills in a way with which nothing in the world can compare. At the waist, they have swords and small battle-axes, and in their hands, javelins with the shafts covered with gold and silver. You will see amongst them dresses of such rich cloths that I do not know where they came from. Shield men with their shields, with many flowers of gold and silver on them, others with figures of tigers and other great beasts, others all are covered with silver leafwork, beautifully wrought. Yet for all this splendor, in the early days, these foot soldiers were often no match for the horsepower of the Bahmani Sultanate. The Bahmanis also leveraged their connections to the vibrant intellectual world of Muslim learning to gain a technological advantage. One of the first sultans, Mohammad Shah Bahmani, was a keen follower of new technologies and even established gunpowder factories in the Sultanate to make use of the emerging technology. The Mongols, having learned of gunpowder from the Chinese, were the first to bring this explosive new technology to India and the Middle East. In its early days, its power was harnessed primarily to launch burning projectiles from catapults or to create primitive rockets. Before long, however, experimenters began channeling its force through metal tubes, first as siege weapons to break down walls, and then as weapons to dominate the open battlefield. The sound of cannon fire would soon echo across medieval India, and the Bahmani sultans' quick adoption of this technology secured them a powerful advantage for centuries to come. This created a curious imbalance, where the larger and often more prosperous Hindu kingdom of Vijayanagara frequently found itself paying tribute to its Muslim neighbors to the north. Their powerful cavalry armies, now being backed by the technological superiority of cannons, simply gave the Bahmanis the upper hand. These conflicts, however, were never truly wars of total conquest. The two powers would clash over a valuable seaport or the rich diamond mines of Raichur that lay between them. Once a clear winner emerged, the loser would inevitably ask for peace, agree to pay a staggering sum of money to the victor, and sometimes even offer a daughter in a marriage alliance before both armies returned home. The idea that one of these rivals would ever completely conquer and absorb the other was never seriously considered. Even so, the growing strength of the Bahmanis was a source of constant anxiety for Vijayanagara's kings. The Bahmani Sultanate soon formed an unbroken belt stretching from India's east coast to its west, walling off Vijayanagara from the north, seizing the wealthy lands of Raichur, and ensuring the southern Hindus kept a fearful watch on their northern frontier. Despite these looming threats, the city of Vijayanagara was expanding at a breathtaking pace. Starting in the mid-14th century, the capital transformed from the center of a wealthy kingdom into a great world capital. A population explosion was fueled by remarkable developments in water management throughout the countryside. Huge teams of laborers constructed new irrigation systems, reservoirs lined with stone, and iconic stepwells that allowed people to draw water from deep within the earth. The city grew voraciously, sprawling outwards to swallow surrounding towns and villages, and soon housed as many as 300,000 people, a time when London's population was a mere fifth of that size, and no city in Europe could claim to be larger. Even Paris paled in comparison, with a population barely crossing the 200,000 mark. By the dawn of the 16th century, only Beijing could claim to be a larger medieval city than Vijayanagara, which had also earned the reputation of being the wealthiest hub in all of India. A poet living during this golden age was so moved by the city's splendor that he captured its essence in verse. His words paint a picture of a visitor wandering through the great city of victory. On every street, the eyes are dazzled by brilliant assembly halls adorned with gold, while homes with shining, mirrored doors line the avenues. Welcoming sights of sugarcane and plantain grow in abundance. The streets teem with powerful fighters, majestic elephants, and swift horses with their riders. The air itself is filled with the fragrant scents of camphor and musk, worn by beautiful women. The poet describes lush gardens, countless precious stones, and the gleam of gold, concluding that anyone who witnessed this city of wealth and glory would have to agree it was the most enchanting place on earth. Part of the city's architectural magic stemmed from a fantastic natural advantage. The surrounding landscape of Hampi offered a virtually endless supply of immense granite boulders. This geological gift meant Vijayanagara became a true city of stone. From grand palaces and fortified walls to humble citizen homes and stables for the royal animals, everything was hewn from solid blocks of granite. The city's growing reputation reached far and wide. In 1443, a diplomat named Abdur-Razak, representing the Persian king from the great Timurid capital of Samarkand, made his way through Vijayanagara. He was so taken aback by its already magnificent skyline that he recorded an absolutely glowing review. In his report, he declared that no eye had ever witnessed such a place, and no mind had ever conceived of a city that could rival it anywhere on the planet. And yet, the city hadn't even reached its peak. Over the next 5 decades, its population swelled to an incredible 500,000 residents by the early 1500s. When a Portuguese writer, Domingo Pires, arrived, he was left utterly speechless by the scale the metropolis had achieved. He wrote that its sheer size was impossible to take in from a single vantage point. To get a better look, he scaled a nearby hill, which revealed a vast portion of the city below. The traveler, Domingo Pires, declared that what he saw seemed as large as Rome and was breathtakingly beautiful to behold. He was also amazed by the sheer abundance found within the markets of Vijayanagara. According to Pires, one could walk down a broad, beautiful street flanked by rows of fine homes, which he understood belonged to the city's wealthiest citizens. Here, he observed, lived countless merchants, and you could find every kind of ruby, diamond, emerald, pearl, fine cloth, and any other earthly thing you might wish to buy. The metropolis of Vijayanagara was composed of several distinct districts, each possessing its own unique character. Near the river was the area now known as the Sacred Center, a name derived from the many massive temples located there. Even today, the mighty Virupaksha temple dominates the skyline, its enormous carved gate tower, known as a gopuram, still soaring high into the sky. In its heyday, these streets would have been alive with the sound of chanting hymns and clanging temple bells, the air thick with incense smoke, and the pleas of worshippers who came to pray for healing and to feel closer to their gods. So vast were many of these temples that the state classified them as towns in their own right for tax purposes. These enormous complexes supported a huge community of retainers and specialists, from dancers and laborers to cooks, cleaners, scholars, holy men, and artists. Further south lay what has been called the urban core, a walled-off area of about 20 square kilometers. This district contained houses and markets, as well as workshops, rest houses, and other commercial enterprises. As historian Atal Chandra Chatterjee described, while most homes were naturally small and simple, They were interspersed with palaces, temples, public buildings, and all the features of a great and wealthy city, including wide, tree-shaded shopping avenues and busy marketplaces. The ruins here clearly show a great deal of religious diversity. Local temples catered to Jains, while separate Hindu temples served followers of both Vishnu and Shiva, and one area even contained a mosque. Arriving around the year 1501, the Portuguese traveler Duarte Barbosa gave a vivid description of this part of the city. He wrote that the houses, though thatched, were very well built and arranged by occupation into long streets with many open plazas. He remarked that the people were so numerous that the streets and squares could not contain them. The city pulsed with immense traffic, accommodating a seemingly endless number of wealthy merchants and tradesmen. The king fostered an environment of incredible liberty, allowing every person to come and go according to their own creed without any fear of annoyance or inquiry. It mattered not if they were Christian, Jew, Moor, or heathen. Barbosa also described the city's rich sensory experience, noting the aromatic clouds that would have wafted from markets selling spices and perfumes. The air was thick with the scents of vermilion, saffron, and rose water, alongside a great store of opium, sandalwood, aloeswood, camphor, and musk. Adding to this was the smell of pepper, which was brought in large quantities from Malabar on donkeys and pack cattle. Vivid scenes of family life would have unfolded here. You can imagine children running through the streets as wood smoke billowed from homes. Men would have gathered on street corners to play games of chance and strategy, chewing on betel nuts and leaves for their mild stimulant effect, a common practice across India. Women could be seen talking in the shade of colorful awnings as cows wandered unhindered through the crowds, and the city's soundscape was often filled by groups of street musicians. It was during this vibrant period that the distinctive form of Indian classical music known as Carnatic music was established. One can easily picture the sounds of this developing art form drifting over the streets and rooftops of Vijayanagara, becoming the soundtrack to the business of everyday life. The day for an average citizen would have commenced with a bath in a neighborhood bathhouse. Men and women had separate bathing areas, which were also made available at different times of the day for privacy. After bathing, families would make their way to a local temple to give offerings and receive blessings for the day ahead. We get a glimpse of the clothing worn by the people of Vijayanagara in the colorful 16th-century murals decorating the walls of temples to Shiva and Vishnu in the village of Lepakshi. These paintings show women with strikingly varied skin tones dressed in saris of multiple ornate patterns from different regions, their hair adorned with pearls. Other murals capture noblemen hunting boar in the forest, their facial hair styled into refined beards and wearing kilt-like lower garments with jeweled necklaces. Turbans and other elaborate headdresses were popular headgear among the wealthy. A love for fragrance was shared by all, as both men and women wore perfumes made of sandalwood, rose water, flowers, civet, and musk. Among all this activity, shopkeepers in this district and everywhere else would have needed to stay constantly alert to the mischief of the local monkeys. Two types of monkeys are still found in great numbers around Hampi today: the silvery-gray Hanuman langurs and the red-faced rhesus macaques. Then, just as now, these creatures loved nothing more than moving in troops, creeping across rooftops and descending from shop awnings to snatch food from any unsuspecting person. Looming over this lively residential area was the royal center. This district consisted of a series of walled compounds that protected the grand palaces and mansions belonging to the city's affluent upper class. It's evident that despite being Hindu, this elite held a significant appreciation for their Muslim adversaries to the north. The architectural design of their spacious homes distinctly reveals a fusion of Indian and Islamic influences. For formal occasions, some Vijayanagara wall paintings even depict the court dressed in attire inspired by their Muslim neighbors, complete with tall caps and flowing gowns. Beyond the city's fortifications, the landscape unfolded into an intricate network of fields and roads. This web connected villages and towns that supplied the great metropolis with grains like rice and millet, along with vegetables such as squashes and gourds. The massive quantities of produce were transported by bullock carts, which would have congested the roads with heavy traffic. Interpretations of Vijayanagara's history differ widely among scholars, a situation that has historically led to intense disputes, often stemming from historians examining the evidence through nationalist, colonial, or post-colonial lenses. While the varying ideologies of these academics play a part, the empire itself was fundamentally a realm of contrasts and paradoxes. On one hand, its sovereigns consciously emulated the great Hindu empires of South India's past, like the Chalukyas, the Pandyas, and the Cholas. This is plainly visible in their temple construction, as these structures were intentionally designed to solidify a link to those preceding Hindu powers. Yet, in many other respects, the empire was an unexpectedly bold experiment, a hybrid civilization that fused Hindu customs with an open-minded, progressive hunger for new ideas from the Islamic world and elsewhere. Survival in the fast-paced and competitive environment of medieval India demanded adaptation, as kingdoms that failed to keep up rarely endured. One monarch in particular, King Devaraya, was acutely conscious of this reality. He resolved to transform Vijayanagara into a modernized, hybrid state, seeking to halt the practice of paying tribute to the formidable Muslim sultanates in the north. His strategy for achieving this goal involved opening the empire up to global influences. Ascending to the throne in the year 1432, Devaraya was merely a child of 8. A visiting Persian diplomat, arriving roughly 8 years into his reign, painted a vivid picture of the now teenage monarch. He described King Devaraya in a green satin robe, wearing a stunning neck collar of exquisite pearls and gems. The ruler himself was tall, lean, and olive-skinned. His youth was obvious from the slight down on his cheeks and beardless chin, yet his entire appearance was described as incredibly captivating. This young king was determined to build a modern, outward-looking state. To do this, he broadcast a message across the Muslim world that his kingdom was open, welcoming talented courtiers. The scholar Farishta recalls that he even enlisted some 200 Muslim officers directly into his army. Farishta recorded that Devaraya gave these men estates and built a mosque for their use in the capital. The king also commanded that no one interfere with their religious practices. Furthermore, he had a Quran placed on a rich desk before his throne, so his Muslim subjects could perform the ceremony of obeisance without violating their laws. This cultural blending is still visible today in temple carvings showing Arab horse handlers and turbaned Muslim riders on powerful, imported horses. The empire's borders were now guarded by large forces of Muslim mercenary cavalry, paid from the vast state treasury. Soon, they were joined by units of Portuguese and Muslim gunners trained in the use of muskets. This influx of newcomers transformed Vijayanagara's military with modern strategies and more cavalry, which in turn changed the city's social fabric. Devaraya also launched major infrastructure projects, digging extensive canal networks that boosted the land's agricultural output around the capital. The metropolis boomed. When the Persian ambassador Abdur-Razzaq visited in 1443, he was so impressed that he wrote an incredible account of the city's markets. He described shops and bazaars crowded between the 3rd and 7th fortress walls. Near the king's palace, the loftiest building of all, stood 4 great markets facing each other, each with a magnificent gallery. The bazaars were so wide and long that flower vendors could line both sides with fresh, fragrant blossoms. Even coming from the wealthy Silk Road hub of Samarkand, Abdur-Razzaq was struck by the citizens' obvious wealth. He wrote that the country was too well populated to describe. The king's treasury had chambers with pits full of molten gold forming one solid mass. Every inhabitant, from high to low, down to the market artisans, wore jewels and gilt ornaments on their ears, neck, arms, wrists, and fingers. The ambassador was especially impressed by the vast stone elephant stables, which survive in the ruins today. He wrote that opposite the minister's office, each elephant had its own high, strong, wood-covered stall. The largest were reserved for the palace, including a huge white elephant with 30 spots of color. This prized animal was brought before the king each morning, as seeing it was considered a favorable omen. His account even gives a somewhat bashful description of the city's apparently thriving red-light district, noting that opposite the mint is the office of the prefect of the city. Apparently, this official commanded a force of 12,000 policemen whose daily salary of 12,000 phanoms was funded entirely by the city's brothels. Abdur-Razak notes that the magnificence of these establishments and the allure of the women within were impossible to put into words, so he thought it best to say no more. At last, the ambassador was granted an audience with King Devaraya himself, who was a young man of only 19. What truly stood out from their conversation was the sheer volume of questions the Hindu monarch had for his Muslim guest. The young king peppered the Persian ambassador with questions about the powerful Islamic empires, wanting to know everything from the number of cavalry the Persian king commanded to the character and conduct of his nobles. This intense curiosity extended to the great cities of Herat and Shiraz, revealing a deep fascination with the wider Muslim world. Life as the ruler of a kingdom like Vijayanagara was, however, fraught with peril. Devaraya's position at the pinnacle of a precarious power structure was constantly threatened by envious competitors. In fact, during Abdur-Razak's visit, this very danger became terrifyingly real. The ambassador witnessed a bold and dramatic attempt on Devaraya-II's life, orchestrated by none other than the king's own brother, starkly illustrating the treacherous nature of royal life. The treacherous brother had devised a chilling two-stage plan. First, he would eliminate every senior figure in the administration, and then, with the path cleared, he would proceed to the royal palace to murder the king. According to Abdur-Razak's account, the initial phase was executed flawlessly. The brother hosted a grand feast at his newly constructed home, extending an invitation to the king and all the empire's leading men. Using the banquet as a pretense, the prince would summon his guests individually, sending messengers to tell each important person it was their turn to be served. It was a carefully laid trap to gather all the drums, kettle drums, trumpets, and flutes that could be found in the city. An overwhelming uproar resulted from these instruments all being played simultaneously. This deafening noise provided cover for a brutal purge. As soon as a targeted individual entered a designated house, 2 assassins lying in ambush would spring out, pierce the victim with a dagger, and then cut him to pieces. The tremendous clamor from the music ensured that, aside from a small circle of conspirators, no one was aware of the carnage unfolding. In this fashion, every person holding a significant name or rank in the state was systematically slaughtered. After this grisly work was finished, the treacherous brother proceeded to the king's quarters to land the final blow of his coup. He entered the royal chamber carrying a plate of betel nuts and leaves for the king to chew, but he had concealed a hidden blade underneath them. The brother came close to the king, announced that the court was ready for him, and then offered the betel. However, the king may have noticed something amiss in his brother's approach. He declined the offer, stating that he did not feel well that day. Abdur-Razak chronicled what happened when the treacherous brother's patience wore thin. Having lost hope of luring the king to the house, this unnatural brother drew his poniard and struck the monarch with several violent blows, causing the prince to fall behind his throne. The traitor, believing the king was now dead, left one of his confidants with instructions to cut off the monarch's head. He then strode out of the hall, ascended to the palace portico, and announced to the people, "I have slain the king. His brothers and such emirs, Brahmins, and viziers. Now I am king." He had, however, failed to account for the king's resilience. As the accomplice of the treacherous brother neared King Devaraya to decapitate him, the king fought back in a spectacular fashion. The prince seized the seat behind which he had fallen and struck the wretch in the chest with so much violence that the man fell onto his back. With assistance from one of his guards, the king then killed this assassin and exited the palace through the harem. Meanwhile, his brother remained on the steps of the council hall, inviting the crowd to recognize him as their king. At that very moment the monarch cried out, "I am alive! I am well and safe! Seize that wretch!" The entire assembly immediately threw themselves upon the guilty prince and put him to death. This dramatic episode gives us a sense of the lethal stakes the emperors of Vijayanagara dealt with every day, and the kings who succeeded Devaraya were not always as fortunate as he was. The great King Devaraya finally died in 1446. His reign represented a golden age, leaving his kingdom larger, wealthier, and more globally connected than he had found it. Yet, the period that followed was marked by chaos and the empire's dissolution. Devaraya's son is said to have mysteriously died of a broken heart, perhaps a polite term for poisoning. His grandson then took the throne, but he would later be murdered by his own son. In a Shakespearean turn, this great-grandson of Devaraya was supposedly so appalled by his own actions that he refused to take the throne he had just killed his father for. He passed it on to one of his younger brothers, who wasted no time in arranging his execution. With this act of fratricide staining the throne, the empire spiraled into chaos, creating a power vacuum that ambitious military leaders were eager to fill. A powerful general named Saluva Narasimha, whose name translates to man-lion, stood out among them. This flamboyant figure was known as a poet and a self-proclaimed master of seduction. In a decisive military coup in 1485, he captured the throne, bringing an end to the Sangama dynasty. This dynasty's 150-year rule stretched all the way back to the very foundation of Vijayanagara by its founding brothers, Bukka and Harihara. The sensual general, Saluva Narasimha, showed little interest in the dull duties of governance. He reportedly dedicated much of his reign to composing a lengthy, detailed manual on the art of lovemaking, only to die a few short years into his rule. This era of instability, marked by his and other ineffective kings' reigns, was the backdrop for a pivotal moment in 1498. That year, the first Portuguese vessel, commanded by the explorer Vasco da Gama, reached South India after completing an unprecedented voyage around the African continent. While he was the first European captain to achieve this feat, a great many would soon follow in his wake. Soon after, the Portuguese established a trading outpost in Goa on the western coast, heralding a future where European powers would steadily expand their influence across India. At that particular time, however, the arrival of these strange visitors barely registered as a concern for the distracted court of Vijayanagara. The empire's long period of internal turmoil and disruption would finally cease under the rule of a man destined to become one of South India's most celebrated and legendary emperors. His name was Krishnadeva Raya, and he would be remembered as the final great king of Vijayanagara. The throne was never Krishnadeva's expected destiny. Although he was a prince, his mother held a lower status compared to the mothers of his siblings. Consequently, his older brothers, Imadi and Varanarasi, each had a chance to sit on the throne before it was his turn. They proved to be disastrous rulers, whose catastrophic mismanagement led to a kingdom plagued by constant rebellions and uprisings. As Krishnadeva's older brother lay on his deathbed, he became obsessed with ensuring his own infant grandson would inherit the crown. The problem was his knowledge that many powerful lords were firmly in his brother Krishnadeva's camp. In a desperate final command, he ordered his brother to be blinded, a mutilation that under Indian law would render him ineligible to rule. Legend tells us the king's servants had zero faith in the baby's ability to hold power, yet they were terrified of provoking their dying master. In a truly daring move, they presented him with the freshly gouged eyes of a slaughtered goat, still dripping with blood, and claimed his order had been fulfilled. The king passed away, content that his dynasty was secure, allowing Krishnadeva to ascend to the throne with ease. We have a vivid description of King Krishnadeva's appearance from the Portuguese traveler Domingo Pires. He records that the king was of a medium height with a fair complexion and a good build, though rather fat than thin. His face bore the telltale signs of smallpox. Pires described him as the most feared and perfect king that could possibly be, while also being cheerful in his disposition and very merry. He was known to seek out and honor foreigners, receiving them with kindness and inquiring about all their business, no matter their station. Pease also noted that he was a great ruler and a man of much justice, though he could be susceptible to certain fits of rage. His official title reflected this immense power: King of Kings, Lord of Great Lords of India, Lord of the Three Seas and of the land. What we might call a fitness fanatic today, Krishnadeva Raya was also dedicated to a grueling physical regimen. Domingo Pease offers the following window into the king's daily routine. Before daylight each day, the king was accustomed to drinking a 3/4 pint of sesame oil and then rubbing the same oil all over his body. Wearing only a small cloth around his loins, he would lift large earthenware weights, after which he would take up a sword. He exercised with the blade until he had sweated out all the oil, then moved on to wrestling with one of his personal wrestlers. To conclude this intense workout, he would mount a horse and gallop across the plain in every direction until the sun came up, as he performed this entire routine before dawn. This same energetic approach was applied to his governance. One of his very first acts as king was to launch a campaign against the troublesome Lord of Elephants, the Gajapati king to the east. Krishnadeva marched his forces into that humid, forested region, capturing important forts as he advanced. But King Krishnadeva was also a poet, and in his epic poem Amaktamaliyada, he memorialized his campaign against the Gajapatis with these words: "In the blue hills of Puri, under the protective gaze of blue-robed Balram and Lord Krishna, whose eyes are like blue water lilies, I prepared for battle and struck fear into the Gajapatis' heart with my powerful arms pounding the drums of war." Ultimately, the Gajapati king surrendered. In a move typical of conflict resolution for the era, he offered his daughter's hand in marriage to Krishnadeva. In return, the victorious king gave all the coastal territory back to the now humbled Gajapatis. This victory surely enhanced his reputation throughout the kingdom and undoubtedly fed what appears to have been an enormous ego. Krishnadeva Raya's own royal inscriptions are overflowing with self-praise. One reads, "Overcome by his glory, the sun sinks into the western ocean as if quite unable to endure the distress of mine." Another boasts that, as if fearing that the 7 oceans would provide a refuge to his enemies, they were dried up by the clouds of dust raised by the earth, trampled to pieces by his horsemen. But Krishnadeva was also a man who understood the mechanics of power and prosperity. He laid out his governing philosophy in a set of political principles, offering guidance on how a kingdom could operate with peak efficiency and maintain its flow of resources. One of his maxims, for instance, advised that a ruler should focus on improving the country's harvest, thereby creating an environment where commoners felt encouraged to freely import valuable goods like horses, elephants, precious gems, sandalwood, and pearls. During his reign, the Vijayanagara Empire experienced unprecedented growth, nearly doubling its territory to reach its greatest historical size and level of central control. Despite this centralization, the empire's core remained feudal in nature. Regional lords, known as *nayakas, governed various territories. While they owed taxes to the central government, they maintained a significant degree of autonomy, a system vividly described by the Portuguese visitor Domingo Pease. He explained that the kingdom's nobles acted as captains, controlling cities, towns, and villages. Their wealth varied enormously, with some earning revenues of 1.5 million pardaus, while others had incomes of 100,000 or even 500,000. Based on this revenue, the king determined the number of foot soldiers, cavalry, and elephants each captain was required to maintain. These forces had to be in a constant state of readiness, prepared for deployment at a moment's notice. On top of this military obligation, every captain was also required to make annual payments directly to the king. Beyond statecraft, Krishnadeva Raya left his mark as a prolific builder. In 1510, to commemorate his ascension to the throne, he commissioned a magnificent gateway tower, a gopura asterisk, to grace the temple of Virupaksha, along with an intricately carved central pillared hall. This incredible structure was engineered with mathematical precision, employing a fractal design where smaller sections of the tower mirror the form of the entire edifice. This technique creates a visually mesmerizing effect and symbolizes the infinite, repeating universes that form a core concept in Hindu cosmology. As scholar William J. Jackson puts it, the tower's elegant and artful form evokes the endless ascending planes of existence and consciousness, reaching for transcendence while simultaneously protecting the sacred essence deep inside. For the neighboring Vitala temple, the king also ordered the creation of an astonishing work of art carved from multiple granite blocks, a stone temple chariot. This masterpiece, featuring wheels and elaborate decorations, remains a stunning centerpiece in the temple's courtyard in Hampi even today. South India was experiencing a genuine golden age, a rare time defined by peace, stability, and widespread prosperity. However, this tranquil era was destined to be short-lived. Krishnadeva Raya would be the last of Vijayanagara's great kings. Within just over 50 years, his sprawling capital would be utterly annihilated, its temples and palaces set ablaze, its streets deserted, and its homes abandoned to decay. Ironically, the catalyst for Vijayanagara's downfall was an event that must have seemed like a moment of triumph for its citizens: the fragmentation and ultimate collapse of their age-old adversary to the north, the Muslim Bahmani Sultanate. Much like the Vijayanagara Empire, the Bahmani Sultanate had built its success on a foundation of blending diverse influences. For many decades, its rulers had actively recruited talent from all corners of the Muslim world, bringing in soldiers, architects, artists, holy men, and scholars. These newcomers had helped forge the Sultanate into a global hub for culture and innovation. This very policy of multicultural importation, however, came with a hidden price. That hidden price soon came due, manifesting as a deep-seated conflict between the native Indian Muslims of the Bahmani Sultanate and a wave of newcomers. These arrivals were mostly Persian-speaking Iranians, collectively known as the Westerners. Resentment toward the growing influence of these foreigners simmered throughout the 15th century, and by the dawn of the 16th, this anger finally erupted into open mutiny. The first to break away was the furious ruler of Ahmednagar, who rebelled in 1490, inspiring the Sultanate's other regions to quickly do the same. By 1509, when Krishnadeva ascended to the throne of Vijayanagara, the Bahmani Sultanate was already a shadow of its former self. Just 9 years later, in 1518, it had completely shattered, fracturing into 5 distinct kingdoms. The sultans of these new states immediately turned on one another, warring over scraps of territory. In just a handful of years, the Bahmani power that had dominated the Deccan for so long had completely evaporated, leaving Vijayanagara as the virtually undisputed master of southern India. For the young king Krishnadeva, a 17-year-old still flush with his triumph over the Gajapatis, the turmoil among his neighbors spelled a clear and present opportunity. His eyes fell upon the Raichur Doab, a rich triangle of land famed for its fertile soil and abundant diamonds. This coveted territory had been under Bahmani control for many years, but with the Sultanate's collapse, it now belonged to just one of the 5 successor states. Its new master was Ismail Adil Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur. Believing that the Sultan could not possibly stand alone against the full might of his empire, Krishnadeva marched to seize the territory in 1520 at the head of a 100,000-man army. Present in the capital during this campaign was the Portuguese Jewish traveler Fernão Nunes, who chronicled the expedition in dramatic detail. He noted that after the king performed the necessary sacrifices to his idols, the army marched out from the city of Vijayanagara in a specific formation. Leading the vanguard was the chief of the guard with 30,000 infantry, including archers, shield-bearers, musketeers, and spearmen, accompanied by 1,000 cavalry and his war elephants. Nunes observed how each soldier was armed according to his role, with archers and musketeers wearing quilted tunics and the shieldmen carrying swords and daggers at their belts. In the following days, This immense force crossed the Tungabhadra River and laid siege to the fortress of Raichur. Krishnadeva soon discovered, however, that this would be no easy conquest. The kings of Vijayanagara, despite employing Portuguese mercenaries armed with muskets, had not yet adopted cannon technology. The Raichur fort was a formidable stronghold perched atop a craggy hill. Lacking effective siege engines, the Hindu army fell back on older methods, trying to hack through the fort's walls with hammers and pickaxes. Meanwhile, the defenders were well equipped with cannons and unleashed a barrage of fire from the ramparts. These cannons did have one significant flaw. Their mountings prevented them from firing directly down at the men working at the base of the walls. Even so, they inflicted a terrible toll on the Vijayanagara soldiers as they advanced across the open ground. With the siege grinding to a stalemate, Krishnadeva received word one morning that the Sultan of Bijapur was personally leading a relief army south. This force was composed of his most elite troops and, crucially, was equipped with nearly 1,000 state-of-the-art cannons imported from Persia. Feeling what was perhaps his first touch of unease, Krishnadeva lifted the siege and marched out to meet the Sultan on the field of battle. Fernão Nunes, an eyewitness to this confrontation, described the incredible sound the two armies made as they prepared to fight. As dawn broke, he wrote, "The drums, trumpets, and other instruments in the king's camp began to play as the men shouted, creating a noise so immense it seemed the sky would fall. The sound of neighing horses and trumpeting elephants added to the cacophony, creating an atmosphere of fear so profound, Nunes believed, that it terrified even the men who were making it. The pandemonium was so absolute that verbal communication became impossible. With the sheer volume of the battle drowning out every spoken word, soldiers on both sides had to rely entirely on hand signals to be understood. This brutal confrontation, which would enter the historical record as the Battle of Raichur, serves as a quintessential example of the violence and utter disarray of medieval warfare. Despite facing a numerically superior army from Vijayanagara, the Sultan of Bijapur was supremely confident. He believed his advanced artillery would easily scatter the Hindu forces and secure him a decisive victory. To kick off the engagement, he gave a single command for a massive, coordinated barrage from every one of his cannons. The chronicler Fernão Nunes described the horrifying result as 1,000 cannonballs ripped through the formations of the Vijayanagara army. According to his account, the Sultan commanded the whole of the artillery at once to open fire, which, discharged as it was very great, did much damage to the enemy, killing many of the horse and foot and many elephants, and it compelled the King Krishnadeva's troops to retire. Seeing their opponents begin to fall back, the Sultan's forces, whom Nunes refers to as the Moors, immediately pressed their advantage. They charged into the retreating lines, cutting them down for nearly half a league. At this moment, the situation appeared utterly hopeless for Vijayanagara, but King Krishnadeva was not ready to concede. Gathering his commanders and his finest horsemen around him, he issued a shocking and merciless order. Nunes captured the king's fury, writing, "When the king saw the way in which his troops fled, he began to cry that they were traitors and that he would see who was his side, and that since they all had to die, they should meet their fate boldly. 'Who ranges himself with me?' he shouted. In response, his loyal lords and captains swarmed to his side. In a dramatic gesture, he removed a ring from his finger, handing it to a page to be delivered to his queens as a symbol of his impending death. With that, he spurred his horse onward with his remaining forces, giving the brutal order to slay any of his own men who continued to flee. As the account tells it, Krishnadeva and his loyalists began cutting down their own retreating soldiers. This grim tactic eventually forced the panicked men to reverse course and charge back toward the enemy. This massive countercharge, a tidal wave of humanity supported by up to 27,000 cavalry, was the pivotal moment that shifted the battle's momentum. A critical vulnerability in the Sultan's strategy was now exposed. Because his cannons had all fired at once, they were all simultaneously out of action as their crews scrambled to reload. The Sultan's soldiers, in their eagerness to chase the retreating foe, had also broken their formations, leaving them disorganized when their quarry suddenly turned on them. The hunted had suddenly and ferociously become the hunter. Nunes described the ensuing chaos. The confusion was so great amongst the Moors, and such havoc was wrought in their ranks that they did not even try to defend the camp, but like lost men, they leapt into the river to save themselves. Then after them came large numbers of the king's troops and elephants, which latter worked amongst the mischief without end, for they seized men with their trunks and tore them into small pieces. A final, decisive push by Vijayanagara's elite soldiers forced the entirety of the Sultan's army into the Krishna River, which became a scene of mass slaughter. Although the forces of Bijapur were crushed, the victory came at a staggering price. 16,000 of Krishnadev's own soldiers had died. Nunes recorded that after the battle, the king stayed till all the dead had been burned and the customary honors had been paid to them. Those numbered 16,000 and odd. Following this costly victory, Krishnadeva returned to the siege of the fort. It was here that he reportedly employed a company of Portuguese mercenaries led by a captain named Krishnadeva de Figueiredo. While Krishnadeva's army already had some soldiers with matchlock muskets, these European fighters came equipped with the latest military technology, arquebuses. These long-barreled guns were capable of an astonishing degree of power and accuracy. The Portuguese chronicler Fernão Nunes captured the dramatic turning point of this final siege, a moment defined by one incredibly skillful, or perhaps incredibly lucky, shot. From a concealed position near the trenches, a Portuguese marksman named Krishnadeva de Figueiredo took aim. He and his fellow musketeers began firing upon the fort's defenders, who were carelessly exposing themselves on the walls with a misplaced sense of fearlessness. As his men began to fall, the city's captain rushed forward, shouting words of encouragement to rally them. In a fatal error of judgment, he leaned through an embrasure to locate the source of the gunfire and was immediately struck in the forehead by a musket ball. The captain's sudden death sent a wave of panic through the city. The defenders abandoned their posts, and Raichur fort quickly surrendered. Seizing these rich lands was an enormous accomplishment, a goal that had eluded many previous kings of Vijayanagara. While Krishnadeva was ecstatic with his triumph, the victory sent ripples of alarm throughout the region's other Muslim kingdoms. According to Fernão Nunes, a parade of diplomats soon arrived at the king's court, each bearing the same cautious message from their respective sultans. Their collective advice was a warning. He should be content with his new prize, avoid overreaching, and resist the temptation to upset the delicate balance of power. Historical hindsight reveals this was a warning he absolutely should have heeded, but the victorious king was in no mood for caution. Krishnadeva's response to every single sultan was identical and defiant, a message that Fernão Nunes dutifully recorded for posterity. The king's reply was essentially this: "Thank you for your letters, but Adil Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur, fully deserved what I did to him. I have no intention of returning his lands, as that would be unreasonable. And as for your threat to unite against me, please don't trouble yourselves with the journey. If you dare to wait for me, I will come to your lands and find you myself." This was his definitive answer. In fact, the young monarch was so emboldened by his success that he resolved to attempt something no Vijayanagara ruler had even considered for over a century. He would march his army north and capture the Sultan's own capital, the great city of Bijapur. Bijapur was not just any city, it was one of the jewels of South India. As the largest and most prosperous metropolis in the territory of the former Bahmani Sultanate, it served as a major hub for commerce, culture, and trade, renowned for its stunning gardens and water pavilions. A visitor from North India was so impressed he later wrote about its incredible beauty. He described the lofty, airy buildings surrounding his residence, the spotless bazaars where every shop was shaded by a beautiful tree, and the markets filled with rare goods unavailable anywhere else. To him, there was perhaps no place on earth that offered a more wonderful spectacle. Accompanying Krishnadeva on this audacious campaign deep into enemy territory was the Portuguese observer, Fernão Nunes. He documented the army's approach to the great city and was particularly struck by its architecture. noting that its houses reminded him of buildings in Europe. Nunes wrote that the king traveled all the way to Bijapur, which he called the best city in the entire kingdom. He described its many beautiful homes constructed in a European style, surrounded by lush gardens and bowers overflowing with grape vines, pomegranates, oranges, and lemons. When the Sultan of Bijapur saw Krishnadeva's colossal army on the horizon, he made the only rational choice available to him. He fled the capital and disappeared into hiding. This allowed Krishnadeva to march into Bijapur completely unopposed. His plan was to occupy the city and wait for the Sultan to surrender himself. The Sultan, Adil Shah, however, remained hidden. In response, Krishnadeva and his forces settled in for a long stay, an occupation that would place an immense strain on the city, ultimately leading to its near-total destruction. To fend off the nightly cold, the occupying soldiers began dismantling the city's beautiful structures, using the pieces for firewood. Their thirst was so great that the local reservoirs were completely drained. As the historian Fernão Nunes noted, Bijapur was systematically taken apart as if consumed by a swarm of termites, leaving nothing but the palaces occupied by Krishnadeva himself. The resulting devastation was profound, a sight described as a great grief to see. This destruction wasn't a direct order from the king. Rather, it was the consequence of his men tearing down countless homes to fuel their cooking fires. Confronting the king, Sultan Adil Shah questioned what crime the city's houses had committed to deserve such a fate, pointing out that only Krishnadeva's temporary royal quarters had been spared. Krishnadeva's response was simple. The demolition was not his doing, and his forces were beyond his control. Ultimately, the complete depletion of the city's drinking water forced Krishnadeva's withdrawal. Although he failed to capture the Sultan of Bijapur, his message had been delivered with brutal clarity. There was no longer any question that Vijayanagara held supreme power in South India. The very sultans who had once posed a serious threat were now sent scattering at the mere approach of its army, their cities seemingly his for the taking, like ripe fruit on a vine. King Krishnadeva obviously reveled in this display of dominance, but it was an insult the Deccan sultans would never forgive. The razing of Bijapur served as a painful lesson. Their internal squabbles only made them vulnerable to being devoured individually by the southern superpower. In a stroke of great irony, Krishnadeva's actions planted the seeds of unity among his enemies. This monumental victory would inadvertently set the stage for the future alliance that would bring about the complete downfall of the Vijayanagara Empire. To understand the sheer opulence of the empire at its peak, one needs only to look at the Mahanavami festival. This spectacular, 10-day celebration, typically held in October, showcased the full extent of Vijayanagara's wealth and grandeur. We have a vivid picture of these chaotic and colorful proceedings thanks to the Persian ambassador, Abdur Razak, who observed the festival in 1443. In his account, he described how the king generously bestowed gold and fine clothing upon all the readers, storytellers, musicians, and jugglers. For 3 straight days, this royal spectacle unfolded in the most magnificent fashion. The sheer number of pyrotechnics, fireworks, and other amusements was simply too vast for one chronicler to describe in full detail. He did, however, vividly recall the splendor of the elephant procession, recounting how 1,000 of the great animals resembled a troubled sea or a gathering storm cloud. Each one was draped in brilliant armor and carried a magnificently decorated castle filled with jugglers and artisans. Artists had even used cinnabar and other pigments to draw extraordinary pictures and figures of stunning beauty on the elephants' trunks and ears. Nearly 80 years later, around the year 1520, the traveler Domingo Pes was fortunate enough to witness this same festival. By his account, it's clear the ceremony's opulence had only intensified. He watched as the king, having completed his rituals, mounted his horse and returned to the city while his troops cheered unceasingly. The soldiers began to march the moment their king passed them. The sight of countless men on the surrounding hills and slopes, all shouting, beating their shields and shaking their bows and arrows, was overwhelming. Pease later confessed, "Truly, I was so carried out with myself that it seemed as if what I saw was a vision and that I was in a dream." As Pease absorbed this unbelievable spectacle, he could not have known that the empire's final chapter was about to begin. He had no way of understanding that within just a few decades, these very streets would lie silent and empty, with only grass and vines pushing up through the stones. The beginning of the end came on October 17, 1529, with the death of Krishnadeva Raya, Vijayanagara's last great monarch. He reportedly fell ill while preparing yet another military campaign against his old rival, the Sultan of Bijapur. For all his success in other kingly duties, he had struggled to produce a male heir. One of his two sons became a victim of courtly scheming at just 6 years old. Being named the crown prince turned out to be a death sentence, as the boy was poisoned less than a year later. A grieving Krishnadeva suspected his own prime minister and had the man blinded in retaliation. When the king finally passed away, his remaining son was considered too young for the throne, so the crown passed to his younger brother, Achyuta. According to the chronicler Fernão Nunes, this new ruler had no aptitude for leadership. King Achyuta, he wrote, gave himself over to vice and tyranny. Nunes described him as a man of very little honesty, whose evil life and inclinations made both the people and his captains deeply discontented. The power vacuum left by the great king's death allowed numerous opportunists to test their luck. The most prominent among them was a divisive and merciless social climber, under whose guidance the empire of Vijayanagara would finally be reduced to ash and flame. As we close the book on this era, please leave a like if this story helped you relax or learn something new. Comment which historical mystery you want me to open up in the next video, and subscribe to the channel to ensure you never miss a night in the archive.